In 1933, Adolf Hitler rises to supremacy in Germany. Alongside his desire for German dominance in Europe, he reoccupied the Rhineland, seized control of Austria, and demanded control over the Sudetenland. Even though democratic countries could have responded to Hitler's aggressive actions with force and coercion, they instead accepted Germany's demands through a policy of appeasement, hoping to have peace in our time. However, these non-violent efforts did not work as Germany proceeded to invade Poland and begin World War II. After the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, ending World War II, a new crisis emerged. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin began to exert control in Europe. The President of the United States, Harry Truman, was now faced with the challenge of his own. In order to combat Stalin's belligerent tactics, he would need to do something that was never done before. But what? The Berlin Blockade and Airlift. In 1948, Soviet forces created a conflict when they surrounded the city of Berlin. In response, the United States, under President Harry Truman, established a peaceful compromise over military action in the form of the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift helped the United States by showing strength without the need to resorting to war. Along with peace, the Berlin Airlift lays down the groundwork for future Cold War policies.
It's a conflict that never winds up being a military conflict, right? So there's never a case that there's actually of a shooting war between East and West. And although there is a great deal of tension and a conflict, that there is still a great deal of, there's conversations that's taking place throughout this entire period. And so that part of the interesting thing about this conflict is that, for example, on the local government level, there continue to be ongoing interactions between police in east and western parts of Berlin.
A significant event occurring near the end of World War II was Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th of 1945, leaving Vice President Harry Truman in control of the U.S. for the remainder and aftermath of the war. Although the two members of the executive office worked together, the two had very different perspectives on the Soviet Union. While Roosevelt planned on becoming a warm ally of the Soviets, Truman and most of the U.S. officials grew suspicious of Soviet intentions with Europe, as it already had control of the eastern side. It was not until the Potsdam Conference that Truman personally met Stalin and identified his high demands, becoming even more uncertain about joining forces with him. The Potsdam Conference discussed the separation of Berlin, the intentions for the country, as well as the fate of Europe.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Tensions began to rise in Europe as the Western Allies drifted away from the Soviets, acknowledging the conflict with Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech that addressed the advancement of Stalin's Iron Curtain and that the Western powers might once again need to prepare for conflict. Truman expressed his opinion on the ordeal with the Truman Doctrine, which was a key foreign policy that stated that the US will fight against communism and protect Western Europe. This was the beginning of the policy of containment, to fight against communists without going to war. The states supplied the city of Berlin with relief assistance, reconstruction loans, and other ancillary techniques, but ultimately everything led to millions being unemployed and unfed.
The airlift was important, not for the reason that's generally given, that is, it kept West Berliners from starving, but I think what is really important is that it demonstrated to Germans, and Berliners in particular, that the United States was prepared to remain in Europe. And I think that a lot of people were concerned that after the Second World War, the American government, would act like after the First World War and essentially pull up their forces and sort of cut off connections with Europe and allow Europe to go on its own. And this became a way of really transforming the relationship between Germans and the Western powers, especially the Americans, from being World War II enemies to being allies in the post-war period.
Not wanting any more countries to join the Iron Curtain, the United States formed the Marshall Plan, an arrangement made to rebuild Europe while ensuring countries don't look towards communism. This and the Truman Doctrine were two different containment policies, a scheme that the United States used when facing the Soviet Union. This was ultimately due to the United States wanting to avoid war with the USSR. Instead, foreshadowing a later conjecture known as the domino theory, when if one country becomes communist, their neighbors would soon follow, the US showed that they were strong and willing to take action. After the collapse of Germany in 1945, the separation of Berlin began, dividing the nation into 4 territorial zones, each controlled by a superpower. A year later, reparation agreements between the Soviets and Western zones broke down. The West responded by merging all of their zones together, causing the USSR to fear that this union would give the West more power than their own zone.
The Soviets were very interested in getting resources out of Berlin and out of Germany more generally, and certainly a big part of that was an effort to try to deal with the fact that there had been incredible devastation and incredible loss of life in the Soviet Union. But I think ultimately the conflict over Berlin came down to these competing visions of what post-war democracy was going to look like. So that the Americans and the Soviets, the British, had different understandings of what post-war democracy would look like, and how they would deal with the legacy of defeated Germany after 1945.
On June 1st, 1948, America and Britain announced that they wanted to create the new nation of Western Germany, influencing the new currency that was produced in Bizonia and Western Germany on the 23rd of June. The people of Eastern Europe began to change their currency to the new coinage because they believed it was more valuable. The following day, the Soviets imposed the Berlin Blockade, blocking all roadways in and out of Berlin. Berlin was deep inside East Germany, and the Soviets knew that if Germany was going to be separated, Berlin would no longer be the capital. This conflict of values added stress, and as American diplomat George F. Kennan recalled, no one was sure as yet how the Russian move could be countered, or whether it could successfully be countered at all. The situation was dark and full of danger. This helped clear the predicament of whether to stay or leave Berlin. The Western Allied nations decided to stay in Berlin, even though it was a tough call to make, which then affected the resolving of the conflict. In order to supply Berlin while deep in the Soviet zone, the Western Allies compromised the conflict with Operation Vittles, which started on June 24, 1948. The initial goal of the operation was to supply Berlin in a short term, as leaders speculated that the airlift would not be enough to supply the entirety of Berlin. However, as time went on, it was clear that it was the best source of action. Famed Western journalist Joseph Kingsbury Smith was one of many journalists that frequently sent out questions to Joseph Stalin, and usually no answer ever emerged. But for him, Stalin replied, stating that if the ongoing work for the creation of West Germany was delayed until the Four-Nation Council of Foreign Ministers could converse, the blockade would be lifted. The Western Allies immediately sensed that Stalin's position was weakening. Stalin did not refer to anything about eliminating the currency that influenced the blockade in the first place. The Western Allies declined the compromise and decided to continue the airlift. On May 12, 1949, the Soviets finally lifted the blockade, and on May 23rd, West Germany was formally established. The Berlin airlift continued until the 8th of September to stock up a year's supply of goods in the case of another Soviet blockade. By the time the airlift was over, a total of 278,888 flights were made, and about 2.3 million tons of cargo were transported. Although the airlift contributed a great degree to the survival of the people in Berlin, it wasn't the only aspect that finished the job.
I think it really brought together these local conflicts over material conditions, that is, supplying food and coal and electricity to West Berliners, and the willingness of the British and the Americans to fly supplies in, even though those supplies were never really doing what they said they were doing, so they were not keeping West Berlin alive. They were supporting them, they were helping, but Berliners were doing a lot on their own.
The decisions made by the USSR to create a blockade that would separate a city would not only lead to increased conflict, but eventually diminish the European desire for communism. The Berlin blockade was the very first conflict between the USSR and the Western Allied nations, setting a precedent for the remainder of the Cold War. The lifting of the blockade caused by the airlift's continuous support of Western Berlin left a legacy that would be uncontested in the years that would come. The US, acting as an auxiliary, would manifest in the hearts of the Soviets and subside incoming violence in the Cold War and future conflicts.